morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Mrs. Savage Hunt again. I am going to walk you through the text-dependent question process, as well as writing a appeal paragraph in response to a text-dependent question. So first thing I want you to make sure you have is your writing journal. And we're going to first open up to our table of contents for quarter one. So I'm going to flip to quarter one, and I've got 3 entries so far. You've got the I love entry, which should be on page 2. You've got life without, which we'll do later. That's going to be on page 4. Today we're going to skip to page 5. We may go past page 6, so I would have to change this if we end up going past 2 pages of notes. So I'm going to jump to page 5. And first we're going to start taking some notes, which I already started. And these are going to be on our essential questions. So we have 3 essential questions that were on the PowerPoint for you to copy down. The first one is, what is a text-dependent question? The second essential question is, how does following the appeal process help me thoroughly answer questions? And the third one, which is story-dependent today, is, do people control society, or does society control people? The next piece, text-dependent question, or a TDQ, you'll be referencing most of the year, if not all of the year. So we're going to draw this little text box, and then we're going to complete the graph together. So when making our text-dependent questions box, I'm going to make a small graphic chart, in my table. So in my notes, I'm going to create a small table for text-dependent questions on what they are, as well as answers to text-dependent questions. So under text-dependent questions on the left-hand side, I'm going to write in that they require careful analysis of text for deeper comprehension. To the right, when I'm creating my answer for a text-dependent question, these can be verbal or written in both short responses and or essays. I'm going to draw a line between them and write the next one. Text-dependent questions also range in difficulty. This means that in our answer, we need to make sure our answer contains a thesis that restates the question. Draw another line. And our third item, text-dependent questions test your ability. They test your ability to choose and explain the most relevant parts in or of a text. So in our answer, when we do this, for testing our ability, we need to make sure that we include at least 2 pieces of properly cited support. And then I'm going to finish drawing my box. Now looking at my box, I want to make sure that I pinpoint some really key pieces. In relation to text-dependent questions, it requires a careful analysis of text for a deeper comprehension. My answers can be verbal or written. For most of these, in our circumstances, are going to be written, but we can occasionally do verbal answers. These are going to range in difficulty. Some may be shorter than others. Some may have an easier question that's quicker for you to answer. No matter what, you need to make sure that you have a thesis that restates the question. The third piece, it's going to test your ability to choose and explain the most relevant parts. And you need to include at least 2 properly cited pieces of support. So if we're looking at the questions that are on your screen, which question is a text-dependent question? Number 1, how do social cliques or groups affect students' experience of going to school? Talk to your partner and see if that is a text-dependent question. Number 2, in Stargirl, how does the author develop Leo's internal conflict? Cite examples from the novel to support your answer. Talk with a different group member to determine if that question is a text-dependent question. Number 3, What does Augustus's eulogy for Hazel reveal about what's most important to him? Use examples from the text to explain. Talk with another group member and determine if that question is a text-dependent question. And number 4, how does facing a fatal illness change the way someone views his or her life and purpose? Talk with another group member and determine if that question is a text-dependent question. In order to answer our text-dependent questions, we're going to be using the Peel process. Last year, I believe you used the RACE format for writing paragraphs. However, this year we're going to be using Peel. So on the next page of my notebook, I'm going to take notes on what Peel stands for. So the first piece, it is an acronym. So Peel, we're going to start with the letter P. P in this case stands for point. So in that first sentence of your paragraph, you want to make sure that you make your point. Now if we go back to our notes on the previous page, you'll see that in our answer, it needs to contain a thesis that restates the question. That's going to go in your making the point. So I'm going to write a small note to myself to restate the question and write a thesis. The second piece in the Peel process is the E. This is going to stand for evidence. This means we need to back it up. Back up what our thesis is. So back it up. We want to support your point with evidence and examples. This is going to be more than one sentence. And then you can use some phrases in the story it states, and then include your evidence. The second E is going to be explain. This means we need to explain how the evidence supports your point. And then at the very end, we're going to use the L, which is going to stand for link. That means that you are linking back to your point, which remember is also your thesis, so you're linking back to your point, or link into what someone else already said. So now that I'm looking at all of my notes, I want to make sure that I pinpoint some important pieces. So I'm going to make sure that I just highlight or underline each of the 4 pieces. I also want to find words that are things to remember. So for point, I want to not only make my point, but I want to restate the question and write a thesis. My evidence needs to back up my thesis, so I need to make sure I am supporting the point with evidence and examples. So evidence and examples. It's always more than one sentence. I need to explain how the evidence supports my point. So again, I'm going back to not only my evidence, but I'm going back to my thesis statement as well. And then I need to link back to the point. So I need to link back to my point, which is also my thesis. So what you're going to do next is you're going to read the story Harrison Bergeron with your teacher. You'll be listening to the story on audio. So while you're listening, you'll be following along with the story in order to thoroughly answer and explain a text-dependent question. All right, so now that we've listened to the story and we've been shocked by the ending, we're going to write an example paragraph. However, this is going to be an I do as a model before we do one together, and then you'll do your own. So for the purposes of this, I want you to write down the question, the text-dependent question example. So I will be modeling through a paragraph and answering a question for you. So our question, I'm going to turn the page, so we're not on page 6 anymore. We're going to turn the page to page number 7. At the very top of my page, I want to make sure I write the title before I write the question. So I'm going to put today's date again. I'm going to write TDQ example, and then I'm also going to write the story name, story title. so I can remember what this example was for. So my question is, citing examples. So citing examples from the text, what can you infer about the type? What can you infer about the type of government that was in existence in the year 2081? So before I go to answer my question, I want to look and see, what is this question asking me to complete? Not only is the question asking me to cite examples, plural, I also need to make sure I include what I infer, so what I can guess based on the story about the type of government that was in existence. So I need to go back to the story and find examples of what the government was like in the year 2081 in order to determine what I infer or think about what the government is like. So first I need to write a thesis statement. Thesis statements are a restatement of the question. So the very first thing I need to do is restate this whole question here. Not including the examples part, just restating the question. So they're asking about the government. I'm going to start with the government. This thesis statement should keep your paragraph in check and flow nicely from where you start. So the government, again, I'm using my question, the government in the year 2081. So far I'm going back to my question again. So the government in the year 2081 has much stronger control of the people in order to provide equality. So my thesis statement is going to touch back on the question itself. So the government in the year 2081 has much stronger control. Now, for me to say that it has stronger control, that's what I'm inferring based on the story. So the government controls the people in order to provide equality to everyone. How do they do that? So first I need to make sure I'm including different ways that the government has provided this equality. So in order to transition into that, I'm going to use a simple transition and just use the word first. This is going to lead into my first example. So again, going back to the appeal process, I'm using evidence right now. So first, many amendments were added. They were added to the Constitution in order to create more equality. And I know what you're thinking. You might be thinking, well, she hasn't included any evidence yet. I'm getting there. Using the next piece, remember I talked about explaining my evidence, and I included in my piece that I could use in the text it says. So I'm going to use that next. It says all this equality was due to the 211th, 212th, and 213th amendments to the Constitution. When you copy something from the text, make sure you also include page number. Where I'm going to go next is further elaborate, but also using another piece of text, because remember, I need to have my evidence, I need to have my explanation, but then I also want to try to have at least two pieces of text evidence. So I always want to make sure that I have two pieces. Here's my first one. The next piece I'm going to use is there's even a specific government position. The United States Handicapper General, whose agents watch over people with unceasing vigilance. I copied this piece from the text, so I need to make sure that I include where I got that text from, also on page 1. The next thing that I need to do is I need to link back. So I'm going to link back to my thesis statement at the beginning. So finally it is clear that this type of government that uses harsh and even deadly methods to enforce equality, as seen in the climax. So finally, it is clear that this type of government that uses harsh and even deadly methods to enforce equality, as seen in the climax. I noticed something is wrong. So finally, it is clear that this type of government uses, so I'm going to remove that, uses harsh and even deadly methods to enforce equality, as seen is shown, is seen. Finally, it is clear that this type of government uses harsh and even deadly methods to enforce equality, as seen in the climax. I'm going to come back to this piece and then conclude it now. So by controlling, still linking back up to my thesis statement at the beginning about talking about the stronger control of the people. So by controlling people with specific handicaps and fear, they could achieve their version of equality. Now, even though I have my paragraph and I've used the Peel process, I don't have everything in there that I need. There are going to be times when you need to go back to a story, edit your paragraph. It's not going to be perfect the first time. So in looking at my thesis statement, I've got the government in the year 2081 has much stronger control in order to provide equality. First, many amendments were added to the Constitution in order to create more equality. It says all this equality was due to the 211th, 212th, and 213th Amendments to the Constitution. Unfortunately, that does not explain to someone who has not read the story exactly what these constitutional amendments are and how they create the equality. So I want to go back and I want to make a little note to myself that I need to add explanation on how equality is. I want to add explanation on how equality is given to all. There's even a specific government position, the United States Handicapper General, whose agents watch over people with unceasing vigilance. Again, even though I have my quote here, I don't explain exactly what unceasing vigilance is. What does the United States Handicapper General do? What do the people do who work for her? So I need to go back in here, and I need to also explain the Handicapper General's job and other government employees. Finally, it is clear that this type of government uses harsh and even deadly methods to enforce equality, as seen in the climax. I could completely take out this scene in the climax piece and include some examples about these deadly methods. So I'm going to put a little note to myself. Deadly methods, what kind? I need to explain this as well. And then at the very end, by controlling people with specific handicaps and fear, they could achieve their lesson of equality. Who am I referring to with they? I'm actually referring to the government. So I need to change they to the government. For me to answer question number 1 or explain with number 1, I need to add explanation on how equality is given to all. With giving everyone equality, you can't make everyone equal without giving them handicaps. So back in the story, it referenced they were equal every which way. Nobody was smarter than anybody else. Nobody was better looking than anybody else. And nobody was stronger or quicker than anybody else. And in order for them to do that, they had handicaps. So I need to add an explanation on how equality is given based on these different amendments. So I'm just going to write little notes to myself. Equality was given to everyone based on their physical and mental characteristics. So for example, George is very smart. So the government put a transmitter in his ear to give bursts of sound to distract him every 20 seconds. Also, because he is strong, he's required to wear bags of birdshot to weigh him down. There are other examples in the story that I could use in order to support this. I'm just going to stick with George for the purposes of this one. My second piece in my paragraph, I need to explain the handicapper general's job, and other government employees. They watch over people with unceasing vigilance. So I have to go back to the story and see where I can find an example of when the handicapper general does this. This is also going to tie into the deadly methods. So if I go to the end of my story and I see that Diana Moon Glampers, who's the handicapper general, came into the studio with a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun. She fired twice. This is talking about the deadly methods. However, there was another piece in here where Hazel was talking with George about the consequences that they would have for taking any of their handicaps off. So instead, I'm going to go back and use this because I need that third part about the deadly methods for here. I need to explain that separately than I do about the handicapper general. So I'm going to go to this part here in the story where Hazel and George are talking, and she sees him and she says to him, "Why don't you stretch out on the sofa so you can rest your handicap bag on the pillows, honey bunch?" And she's referring to those 47 pounds of birdshot, which was padlocked around George's neck. And she says, "Go on and rest the bag for a little while. I don't care if you're not equal to me." So what he says is, "I don't notice it anymore. It's a part of me." However, he talks about the consequence. 2 years in prison and $2,000 fine for every ball I took out. I don't call that a bargain. He also later says, "If I tried to get away with it, then other people get away with it. And pretty soon we'd be right back to the dark ages again, with everybody competing against everybody else." So I went back to the story and I found these examples. So for number 2, I need to explain how the handicapper general and her job and other government employees enforce this. It doesn't specifically come out and say to the audience how they enforce it. However, we can infer from the way that George reacts to Hazel's comments that he knows of the consequences and he does not want to experience them. So for number 2, in explaining how the handicapper general does what she does with her workers, I would say that the community understands the law and its consequences for breaking the law by the way George explains. So the community understands the law and its consequences for breaking it by the way George explains that he'd receive 2 years in prison and $2,000 fine for every ball he took out. That's on page 2. And this would result in everyone competing against each other again. So the handicapper general and other employees keep vigilant by monitoring the handicaps and requiring people to wear them. Then for number 3, I need to go over deadly methods. So again, I went back to my story. I found some examples. At the very end, when Diana Moon Glampers comes into the studio with a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun and fires twice, the Emperor and Empress were dead before they hit the floor. She also loads the gun again and aims it at other people in order to make sure they put their handicaps back on. So I'm going to just write a small note to myself for question 3, deadly methods, what kind, and explain deadly methods. Shot Harrison and his Empress, threatened musicians to put handicaps back on or they'd be shot too. So then my very last piece to make sure I have my paragraph completely done is to take not only what I have at the very beginning with my rough draft and all of my editing notes, I need to now go back and add in my first piece, my second piece, and my third piece to put it all together in a really great text-dependent question answer using the peel process.